What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hollywood Already Did It Under the Dome edition. As always, I'm your host, Blake Schultz, and with me is Terrence Tatum, and this is, I believe, week 6 of COVID-19 social isolation.
Yeah,
It's, April 26th at
that sounds
4:07
right.
p.m. PST.
Yeah,
We have to start every podcast now like we're a tape in Fallout 3 that someone can document and know, and
I feel like
there's got to be clues to safes and combinations that we've
it's
hidden
a
things away in.
it's a Bioshock or Resident Evil tape that we've left behind in case someone in the future needs to find this.
Right. If they need the heart-shaped key to open the other 5 doors in the mansion, they'll know where to look now. Um, the movie theaters are still closed. We are still practicing social distancing. So as such, today we're going to be talking about the Netflix movie, which I guess is an adaptation of a graphic novel, Extraction, adapted from the Russo Brothers' Ciudad graphic novel that they wrote several years ago, and upon completing began writing this script for it, as they had taken off as directors by that point and saw a different opportunity, starring Chris Hemsworth. And it's #1 in the US today on Netflix. So that's about as close to box office numbers as you can get. I have to assume that by the sheer nature of when this is released, that they're going to be like, we need to make a sequel. The people love it. But
Yeah,
that's a false read.
it is a false read, and it's weird now. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. They might have had it right before this all started, but I feel like the Netflix top 10 is a relatively new thing. And in it, it seems like that is what I've been basing my off of. Like, oh, this is now what's top 10 in the country, or what's top 5 in the country is this. And you're right, it's a false positive of what that actually means because not everyone is watching Netflix. There's different options. It's only reading what people are watching on this particular network, and everyone's forced home, so this wouldn't be an equivalent of what a normal world would be.
Yeah, like I just don't know that I believe people are actually watching Extraction and not just rewatching The Office again.
Right.
But they'll never give us numbers, so we'll never know.
I also have a weird thing about like always it being Netflix original stuff as opposed to something else that's in their top 10. I'm like, well, is this like if McDonald's came up with a new thing? It was like, cool, McDonald's fries are #1. We also sell Burger King stuff, but don't pay attention to that. This is #1. It's like, well, of course you're going to promote your new thing as being the #1 thing.
Yeah, it's sort of like if Walmart opened a mall and constantly was saying that their products were the best, but they had a Target and a Best Buy in there.
Right.
And they were like, no, it's fine. Don't worry about any of that. This is the best.
Right.
But I mean, I get it. It's the top thing of their originals, of their stuff that's new, that's promoting. It's a good way to get eyes on it. It's an interesting It worked on me. I open it up and go, oh, that's what's currently trending.
I actually have been doing that too because I'm in between what I normally was watching, and I was like, all right, let's see what's new. And I'm like, well, let me start with the top 10 on this Netflix thing. I'm like, oh, I've seen that. What is this? And I was sort of aware of this because I knew that Hemsworth had a new Netflix thing coming out. I didn't realize that it was produced by the Russos, but
yeah, this had been in production for a long time under the title DACA. That they kind of announced it. I want to say maybe even before that, but right around Infinity War Endgame when they were sort of wrapping up their Marvel deal, they got this, like everybody who's worth their salt in Hollywood now gets a Netflix deal. And and carte blanche to do whatever they want. So we're going to be drowning in Russo Brothers and Ryan Murphy's for the foreseeable future, which is fine. But it was, published off this graphic novel they were doing. I think they're piggybacking off of a kind of a weird idea that I think a lot of people are starting to try to do, where they write the source material to prove it works somewhere, and then they can kind of adapt it in this weird way.
Like a proof of concept first, and then see if people are interested, and then move on.
Well, it's like they think that it's not the IPs that are popular, it's just the concept of adapting. That Iron Man would have been popular if it was anybody and they had just said, it's adapted from a thing.
As long as it was a graphic novel first, people would be like, cool, it's adapted from a graphic novel, so we'll go with it.
Yeah, it's odd, but what did you think? This is also, at least for me, one of the first big tentpole type movies I watched on Netflix straight up. I skipped Six Underground and Bright.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up because that I've seen them all. I didn't see Spencer Confidential, but I did watch
Oh, that
uh,
wasn't good.
but I did see Bright and Six Underground, and I felt like this. Look, Michael Bay is always going to put all of his money on the screen, sometimes to an excess, most of the time to an excess. So that felt like a big budget film, but this is the first time that I watched one that I felt like a big budget film that I was actually invested in and interested in, like from start to finish. I liked it. I don't think it's not mind boggling or one of the greatest things that I've ever seen. It's a very basic John Wick John Wick esque formula that's going with this, sort of like John Wick and Taken put together with a like Ghost Recon sheen. But I dug it.
I have a whole list of movies that will
Yeah,
Frankenstein together to make this one.
yeah, but I at the base of it, I dug it, and I think a lot of that just goes one that Chris Hemsworth is a very charismatic person, but I also think that you have a stunt. It's weird that these stunt people are becoming filmmakers because some of them are better than others, but I think when you have the Russos behind you, this stunt person who had worked on Endgame and whatnot made a film that actually was pretty solid from top to finish. It's a B movie, like 90s style action film, and I dug that because sometimes that's all I need to escape for a bit.
Well, it's sort of a almost lost genre that I don't think you really get anymore. I feel like now the big bombastic action movies that usually flood the summer, your diehards and Lethal Weapons were almost replaced by the superhero genre in the mid thousands, and we started just getting everything with that kind of Marvel coat of paint and these PG-13 movies until we got to the Raid and John Wick and Mission Impossible sort of started coming back. But even then, it's been so long since we've had a big original IP action movie that's kind of taking all of these lessons from 70s movies, 80s movies, and 90s movies. And what works so well about that is there's a lot of cool cues that they pick up, and where it kind of falls flat for me is learning how to connect to this main character, because we sort of start the movie off in a very generic tropey way. We do the like, oh, they're going to the club and something bad is obviously going to happen here, and it's the drug trade and it's this and it's that and these familiar beats. And when you finally meet Chris Hemsworth, it's a character that I already feel like I know. Like, he feels like somebody at a party that I met and just forgot his name, but I've actually seen him 100 times.
A prototype of every single 90s to 2000 early 2000s action hero that you like. I know this guy. I may not know this particular name, but I know him from top to bottom.
Yeah, you get the kind of, oh, he's so like nonchalant the way he jumps off this cliff, and he's the one man army that can do everything, but he's apathetic. Oh, and he's got this secret past that we don't know about that he's trying to reconcile with, and he's got a death wish and he's got nothing to live for. And I just, between the John Wicks and the Logans and Mel Gibson and Lethal Weapon and even just a little bit of Triple X, I feel like I've met this guy every summer around June 6th.
Yeah, I definitely feel like if this was a movie that got commercials in the 90s, it would definitely be that old tropey Death Wish style, like, he's got nothing to live for. Like, all right, cool, I got it, guys, I got it.
And it never really hits the like grindhouse type camp, right? But they kind of try to keep it in this weird, like, hyper grounded, but also like John Wickian super violent stunts. And it really wasn't until we got to the first car chase that I was hooked in and really realized what I was watching. Because you're right, the roots of this director are stunts, the same way that the John Wick directors came from the Matrix stuntmen. This is in-game stunts in this. And when you see that flourish, when he wipes out the first few people, and then gets in this single shot car chase with, I don't know if it's on a techno crane or if we
I
got some
don't know
Birdman
how they filmed
editing.
that, but my God, that was fantastic.
It was incredible. It kind of made 1917 look like a bitch. Like, it just cranked up the speed on it and just kept going with this force of nature. And that's when I kind of clicked and went, oh, this is the kind of movie I'm watching. It's less of a character piece. So it's almost, I'll forgive you for getting really cliche with who he is, because what I'm
Exactly.
really watching is a tech demo for what this director can bring to the
And
table.
that's exactly what it had. It's about the same time that it clicked for me, because the beginning half of this, you're right. Especially when we start with the flashback and then we flash forward and like the time thing. I was like, oh, we've done this before. And I'm like, this is how you're explaining your character. And for the first, I don't know, what, 20 minutes of this, it is a lot of, we're trying to learn about this character, or we're trying to learn about this kid. We're just placing these pieces on the board. And it's not until we get to that first time where he wipes people out, and then we get that basically what they amount to a 12-minute one shot or single shot. I'm like, oh, this is what we're doing. Well, why couldn't we have started here? You could have gotten rid of all the other stuff and just put me in here, and I would have still been as amped, probably more amped for what I was getting into.
Yeah, and that's not to say the movie isn't without emotional beats. I thought they did a really, really good job with David Harbour and their relationship, and
That
the
whole scene was great.
turnaround you see there really kind of cranked up what was ultimately a story we've seen a lot of. Everybody wants the kid for different reasons, and when you sort of get there, he almost gives you the emotional catharsis that Chris Hemsworth's character never really achieves, where we really see somebody who's been beat up by this system and wants out and thinks he's doing what's right for his friend
Yeah,
by, being comfortable with shooting a kid in the face.
I think that whole everything from Harbor in Harbor's character's home was great to me, because I think the interaction between Tyler and Harbor's character was great, and I also think the stuff that happened between Tyler and the kid in that upstairs when they were talking about when the kid was just rattling off questions to him. It's a sort of ham-fisted because you're getting it all at once, and I'm like, I don't know if Tyler, the way that they built this character, Tyler would just expose all of this at this point in time to this kid that he doesn't really know, but it worked in that scene, so I was okay with it.
Yeah, I think for that scene to work, you really, really have to buy into this notion that this kid is now what Tyler lives for and lives through and is doing, almost like a JD Dr. Cox relationship that he never got to have. And he's trying to do it in 30 minutes. It's that Molly's Game scene where the dad comes in at the end and goes, I'm going to give you 3 years of therapy in 3 minutes. And I think you either buy into the notion that this is his world and he knows that he's going to die for this kid now, so he's going to try to build him up to be the best kid he can be, or you're just like, well, I guess we have to put all this information somewhere, because once this roller coaster drops, it doesn't really stop.
Right, and I think that's why, like, I guess in the graphic novel, the person that Tyler goes to rescue is a young girl, and I think that's why it worked a little bit better in this film to make, if he lost his son as a young person, putting another boy on the board for him to have to say makes that connection a little easier for me to buy, because I'm like, oh, he's just replicating the time that he ran away from his kid. Now he's like, I'm going to run to and help this one. So
Right. And I mean, I gotta say, for a movie that, and we'll kind of get into the quote unquote adaptation part of this in a few minutes, but for a movie that I kind of kept pulling out all of these threads of other movies and ideas I've seen before and beats I've seen before, I've never really seen this many child soldiers fight Chris Hemsworth.
And I love that, even though, look, this is probably the one time that using someone as charismatic and as funny as Chris, who in real life is, and making him so stoic, seems a little bit of an odd juxtaposition because his characters were very one note. But that's the one moment he got to kind of play, because those kids kept coming. He's like, what the fuck is happening right now?
Yeah, that was the weird turn for me, because the first time we do it, you've got this great sequence with this malnourished, sad looking child holding a gun and threatening Chris Hemsworth, where,
Right.
when you're a freshman, a senior looks like the Hulk. So I can
Like
only imagine what he thinks he's doing.
Right.
And they did such a good job of showing you how a drug cartel, drug lord, whatever the villain's title really is, manipulating and brainwashing these kids and abusing them to do these terrible things for him.
Right.
And, it gives you that moment where it's like, well, Chris Hemsworth is a killer, but he's up against child killers. So
Right.
he's the hero.
Yeah.
But then you get this whole action scene where there's like 4 or 5 of them, and just watching Chris Hemsworth slap the shit out of children and try not to kill them.
Yeah.
I know you're not supposed to laugh at that, but I just couldn't help but laugh at it. Like,
he backhand slapped one of them so hard, I just fell out. I was like, oh my God, this is great.
yeah, because he's not going to kill him, but he's like got to swat him away.
Right.
It's a very interesting thing, but it's certainly something in an action movie that I've never seen, and I think adds an additional like Call of Duty type challenge to it, where it's get through this level, but now do it without hurting these children.
Right. Like, you're now without guns because you can't kill them.
It's a very unique way to raise the stakes and keep a threat at him, because that is where he gets stabbed. And I think they do a good job too of just showing you through this what ultimately is only a couple days, I think, narratively.
About like a 40-hour run, roughly. Yeah.
Like just how hurt he is by the time we get to this bridge. And
I was gonna say I like that too. They sort of gotten away from that a little bit in the John Wick series. He's now become a superhero, but in that first one, sort of like with Die Hard, you felt the pain. So when he got his arm broken or when he's in a sling, you feel like, oh, he's actually a human. Like, yeah, he can do some crazy, he can kill a lot of people and do a crazy shit because that's his job. But he's also human and can take a butt whooping. And I dug that we showed both sides of that.
Yeah, well, and it was good to watch him complete that narrative arc of, I don't want to say being suicidal, but like having that death wish chip on his shoulder, and like watching him. It shows, I think, that the stuntman is a very good director, and I don't want to discredit anything because I think he did a very good job. But there's some like not super deep imagery to it, right? Of we're gonna watch this kid literally run across a bridge to safety, and he's going to like feel completed, as if that's
right.
That visualization is the last point. And we see him, dive into water and meditate, and he falls into water. So you have this at peace moment that works for me.
I'm a sucker for that. I'm a sucker for it, but it is on the nose. But I think because this movie doesn't try to make itself seem deeper than it needs to be, and because it doesn't, I'm like, all right, I'll just accept that then. That's fine.
I think that's the other reason it took me a while to get hooked in, because it started off trying to be deeper than it was, and we had to start on the bridge like in Deadpool and have these cutbacks to this person, and you don't know if it's a wife and you don't know if it's his kid, and it's on the beach and we don't know what's happening, and we have to have these like artsy one-liners about how the Oxycontin in his room is just another bullet in the chamber, and you're playing Russian roulette with your career, and all of these kind of like, top heavy things to start this character on his journey that we don't really see him reconcile with at all throughout the movie. It's a very interesting arc, because I felt like outside of when he just pours it all out to this kid, and then the ending, there wasn't that much growth. Like, we have a character who starts off being willing to die and then finds something to live for, but that doesn't convince him to keep fighting to live. He just sort of
like, well, I'll just go ahead and die for this kid. Yeah, it's weird too, because that opening sequence was a little heavy-handed with him imagining his kid on the beach, who we don't see his face. Like, we don't see the face until the end when things get rectified for him, and then you kind of actually see his face. It's like, oh, that makes sense. He wasn't able to see his kid when he was in pain, and then when he sort of lets go, he finally is. So that worked. But there are some artistic choices that I think when you get down to it, like, you could just remove those and just be a straight up 90s style action film, and I would take you more serious that way if you chose a lane as opposed to start merging that's where it gets a little muddy.
Well, it's a narrative that we understand, right? So we don't really need it to. It hits us over the head a lot in the beginning, and then it executes it much more subtly at the end.
Yeah.
Which is kind of an interesting thing. It almost feels like the director got better as he was making the movie. Of course,
Right.
they don't shoot things linearly, so that we don't know how they shot it. I don't have call sheets in front of me.
Yeah.
I do also think it's interesting in that bridge sequence when he kind of makes the sacrifice. We had to build up this villain throughout the movie and this other kid who's part of this manipulative system and loses his fingers and now just wants to prove himself to this drug lord. And he's got to pull the trigger on Chris Hemsworth because he made him look like a bitch. And he shows up to shoot him in the back of the neck. And I was like, okay, kid, you didn't really get it because he doesn't even know you did it.
Right. He didn't stand for bravery.
Up and you did it the lamest way.
You did it, one, from behind him, and two, miles, like you were some feet away.
You had to get whipped up and down this court before you were even able to get him in your sights.
Right.
Like you didn't do anything during this drug lord's respect. You showed him that you're only going to come and play when it's on easy mode. You're only going to show up at the bottom of the 9th inning when the pitcher's tired to try to hit the ball.
And you think about it, the crime lord sniper had already taken the majority of it out of him at that point.
That's the guy who gets the seat at the table. He ran. You did that guy out on day one. This American sniper sequence at the end was awesome.
It was.
And just the right mix of like John Wick violence, but not quite Tarantino. Like there was a lot of blood and gore, but it was never.
But it was
cartoonish.
Yes, it didn't feel like it was over the top because there were moments when in that first one where the rake gets broken off and I was like, oh, this is about to get super violent, but it still plays itself like quote unquote, this is going to sound weird, but tastefully violent. Like I don't need to see the eye being popped. I can just put the pieces together with the editing and I get it.
The violence and the action is really where the movie stands out. There were some deaths in this where you really felt him get hit. I loved it.
Yeah.
That sniper just starts taking pot shots and you've got him cornered behind it like it's Gears of War. I was all in.
That shot.
I was really hoping we were going to have this American Sniper third act and it was going to be sniper counter sniper.
I'm telling you, I was glued to my screen when Tyler threw the kid. It was like, do you trust me? Threw him across, jumped across. And I was like, oh, we haven't stopped moving. Like, what is going on right now?
Yeah, that 16-minute shot that we already talked about. I think at one point I like checked my phone or made lunch and came back and I had to ask my roommate and guest of the show, Zane. I was like, did we cut away yet? And he was like, not, there's some tricks, but we haven't fully stopped the shot. I was like, well, let's keep doing this.
Right. I was like, that's great.
But they really make you want those villains to die when you get there and you see the first one toss this kid off a roof and the sheer ruthlessness and relentlessness of these villains that they built ultimately for a prize that I still am not fully clear what he wanted outside of just to humiliate this dude who was in prison by stealing his kid. And none of them, one of them gets shot in the face, but I wanted a Godfather ending and just watch all these guys get mowed down. That's all I really have to say, those last few seconds on my overall thoughts of the movie, unless you want to start talking about this ambiguous ending, or we could talk about the quote-unquote adaptations that it's taking.
I do want to kind of get on the ambiguous ending a little bit, because it was the one thing that kind of made my eye roll a little bit, because
yes,
I was like, pick a lane and choose it. Don't leave me on this hanging off thing. And my understanding is, because I watched the interview with them while they were social distancing and being asked about it, they wanted this to be an ambiguous ending, which made me a little angrier.
So let me see if I can pull up the article I was looking at right before we started. Here we go. So Collider posted this. Let me get all the names right. Adam Chitwood on Collider 2 days ago posted an interview they did with the director, where he goes on to say that originally Joe Russo wrote an ending where Tyler explicitly dies, and that was what they wanted to do. Then they tested the movie, and quote, this is the director's quote, We had a version of the movie, and we tested it a lot, and it was not surprising that a lot of people wanted the character to live. Some people wanted him to die. People were torn. It was almost down the middle. We want to appeal to as many people as possible without compromising the integrity of the story. And so, we think that a pretty good compromise is to make an ambiguous ending. If people on one hand feel like the story is complete and is a story that is redemption through sacrifice, then for them, it'll be where the kid is imagining Rake standing there, and then now you go, yes, I'm satisfied. If you feel like you love Tyler Rake and you love Chris Hemsworth and you want a sequel and you're like, there's no way, you can't kill him, then that's Tyler Rake standing there looking at you. So we kind of purposefully did not pull focus to the characters standing there. He goes on to talk a lot more about they shot multiple endings, they did all sorts of tests. The director's original idea was redemption through sacrifice. We get to the end of this arc. He found something to live for. He lived for it, and he ultimately died. Also go on to say that they got a note from Scott Stuber, the executive in charge of original films at Netflix, saying his note to him was that you have to know the difference between an intellectually satisfying ending and an emotionally satisfying ending. And they struggled with that concept of, is it more emotionally satisfying for Rake to live or Rake to die? And truthfully, that vote was that it's more emotionally satisfying if he lives, because the kid gave him something to live for, and now he's living for that. I have a lot of thoughts on all of that, but would you like to go first?
So a part of that makes me really angry is the fact that you, as a writer and or as a director, depending on who gets the bigger say of how your film comes out, went by a choose your own adventure style of ending this film based on the ending of some scatterbrained people who are in some test audiences, as opposed to you having a clear cut, this is the vision that I want for my film. And that just kind of makes everything, all the good and great stuff that happened in this film kind of for naught, because you chose at that point to not stick to your guns or stick to your morals and like, well, I'm just going to appease everyone by appeasing no one.
That's kind of exactly what I was going to say. There's the old adage of, if you make a film, really anything, for everyone, you've ultimately made something that's for no one, because you're not going to win every time.
Right.
So I see the stance. I see this from the business side, right? I fully understand Netflix going, but sequels.
Right.
So of course you want to keep it ambiguous, and of course you want to do this. I personally have never been a big fan of an ambiguous ending. I would much rather you sort of like tell me what it is, unless the whole movie is up for interpretation. Something like Us is kind of an ambiguous ending, but that whole movie is about you kind of piecing together what you think is happening and what you believe. And really, the ending isn't that ambiguous. We lose.
Right.
Like,
yeah,
that family gets out, and the nation is under a giant problem.
Correct.
Like, that's not ambiguous. It's ambiguous what it means and what it alludes to and what it represents. This isn't that kind of a movie. This is an action movie with a hero and an arc. And we were talking a little bit about overdoing or over-directing or making your movie smarter than it is. And I feel like that leans into this, where you could have sort of planted the seeds for this kid to almost become a John Wick character. And your sequel would be 10, 15 years later, and he would grow up and go look for this kid with two fingers who shot Chris Hemsworth and all of the other people that are part of this gang and all the other problems in it. Now, I kind of like the idea of he gets up and he sees this image of him and he's always watching over him and all of this. But it also bothers me that they had to do multiple test endings, which means these guys really believed in this original hard ending, and either audiences didn't understand it or they didn't like it, or a little bit of both. And I think sometimes that's how the movie should be. I think we would be having a much more impactful conversation about the themes in this movie that we haven't really hit on as much, because if your theme is redemption through sacrifice and learning to get over your own trauma and learning to have something that's worth living for, ultimately having that be what kills you, those themes don't connect if you walk out bulletproof. And if you're going to, shoot a guy in the neck and drop him off a cliff and then show him fuzzy in the background, you've also kind of made your grounded movie less grounded.
It was a superhero film, sort of like when my complaint with John Wick 3 was when he falls off that rooftop and like ping pongs down the alleyway, and then all of a sudden we see him walking again. You're like, well, hold on. So this guy is now superhuman. It was weird for me because I was sitting there like, oh my god, this is a ballsy ending. You shot this dude in the neck and he died. That's amazing. And then we get the little button at the end, and I'm like, oh no, you've just undone everything that I thought was kind of being that special like bow for you guys to kind of. This is my claim to fame. We killed our hero, and we're gonna be this one-off. I like the idea, and this is the idea that they've been playing with, saying that since we don't actually get focused on him, it could be just kind of like the aura of Tyler or like the spirit of Tyler.
Right.
Tyler. Fine, whatever. But I still think that's a cheap way to do that, considering by that point some time had passed and the main person that was the impetus of this film, the villain, had already been killed. So it's kind of just like, now we're doing this as a coda because we really have no other way to kind of wrap all this together. And that's disappointing.
Yeah, because you go through this, not long walk, but you go through this walk to have the kid do the same meditative process and get under the water and collect himself and whatever that was supposed to represent for Chris Hemsworth's character. He's now going through that same process. He's also grieving now. You give him the same impetus that you gave Chris Hemsworth by having him have this person he cared about die, and now he has to now live for that. That to me is a much stronger concept than, I don't know, the shrug emoji. Like, yeah. I get it. It's fun to have these conversations. And I get when directors in movies and they go, we really wanted people talking about the movie, and we really wanted to evoke these conversations of what do you think it means and what do you think it meant, and do you think he's alive or not, and all of this stuff. But I'm going to use Us again as the example because that was really the last time I think I had a movie like that where I really talked about what do you think it is, and every day we got new breadcrumbs. And then I'll use a different example of a movie that we've talked about for years and what things meant and what it represented, and that's Logan, where we did make the decision to kill this character, and we did make the decision to have the girl he was protecting go on her own. We still have those conversations. So to pretend that your movie needs to be ambiguous for you and I to do a podcast after it is utter nonsense.
I think that's what made me, because I watched this the writing, what you talked about is the video that I watched, and I think that's what my biggest takeaway was. I was like, so you're saying that if you were to kill him and stick to your guns, that a conversation wouldn't be broached by that? Because I feel like I would have a conversation like, oh my god, they have the balls to kill this guy, and then maybe this kid picks up the mantle because that lady is still alive. Like his handler was still around, so she could be like, I'm going to train you. If this is something you want to get into, fine, we can go down that path.
A lot of interesting ideas.
I have more interest in that than this ghost possible thing in the background.
Right, because now really what you're setting up, if you do an Extraction 2, is what Chris Hemsworth does this movie again.
Right.
Like, there was a lot more interesting narrative to do to move this along, and I know that we live in a world of sequels and reboots and adaptations, and we need to set up these breadcrumbs, but I think if you can get creative enough, you have those breadcrumbs, and now you've, to me at least, taken away the motivation for much more, because the kid doesn't really have to learn to fend for himself. He has a guardian angel who will John Wick his way through every Call of Duty map, win the day.
Right.
But that's the ending. The testing process is, I think, interesting because we've seen a lot of good come out of it, I think, where endings like Get Out that were going to be very, very hard ended up being kind of the levity and the hope that the movie needs. But it's hard to make those decisions when you're kind of confronted with what 250 people think.
Right. There are ups and downs to all of it. And I think it's a process that should, obviously, it's nuts and bolts. It makes some things better. I think for me, where my brain goes is like, if you're doing a test audience for a movie that is going to be released not to the masses, like this was always going to be a Netflix original, then you have a little bit more wiggle room to not be as general audience on your ending as you would be if you're releasing this to a major cinema chain. I think you have a little bit more to play with. And you're like, look, we don't have to appease everybody or be a quote unquote four quadrant, even though clearly that's not what this film is going for. But we can be a little bit more focused in what we do because this is a Netflix film and our audience is going to be specifically looking for a type of film that we are giving them.
Right.
And I would think that this would be the point to be like, all right, we can try this with this film because this isn't a $100 million movie. This is a $65 million project that we can kind of play with.
Yeah, it's, they at least didn't do the thing where they assumed they're getting a sequel. Like, a part of me thought he was going to come up from the water and get snatched away, and it was going to be a whole, like, oh, well, we got to go to the hospital and get Chris Hemsworth back and make him the Bionic Man, and this is secretly a prequel to Bionic Commando, and why not?
The one thing that I love about this whole process that this film, because Chris Hemsworth would be considered an A-list star, but he doesn't release A-list movies as far as what he gets as a draw outside of Thor. Like, he's had movies like Rush, Black Hat, 12 Strong, but they've all box office bombed. But I think you can now get in this weird world where outside of the Thor stuff that he does, I mean, in Black Bomb too, outside of the Thor stuff that he does, maybe the window would be to be like, let me produce and do these smaller things on Netflix. Since I am a name, people do know me, but they're not going to go to the theater to see me. But they might cut on their Netflix box and be like, yo, Thor's got a new movie out. Let me watch this because I'm at home and I don't have to do anything outside of my norm to watch this. And I think if you're going to have the Russos produce it, like I think Chadwick's film, the 21 Bridges or whatever that was that came out, that just kept getting pushed and nobody actually saw when it actually released, would have done better had it taken this model as opposed to being released in theaters.
Yeah, I mean, we are having a lot of these talks in this COVID-19 world of digital distribution, but the streaming has always kind of been here to stay. And I think when you stack this movie up with a lot of the other Netflix originals, and I can't speak to numbers because they're not out, but we know things like The Kissing Booth and P.S. I Love You. Is that the title?
P.S. I Still Love You, I think is the second one, but yeah.
Sure. To All the Boys I Loved Before, whatever. They've kind of nailed these like smaller John Hughes female-centric fun comedies that people are watching. And there's sort of efforts to make these AAA tentpole, what would be a franchise-building moment if it was at a Paramount or a Warner Brothers, haven't really connected. Bright didn't really do it. Spencer Confidential didn't really do it. I don't think Six Underground really pulled it off. If they can kind of keep making more stuff like this, I'd all about it. I don't know that I necessarily need it to be a bunch of sequels. I understand that is probably where it'll go, but I would love to once every other week pop on Netflix and just have what would have been a like Italian Job sized movie in the mid thousands or late 90s that probably wouldn't really get attention with a theatrical release. Be number one in the US, even if it's by a silly metric where, the guy who's growing the corn is also telling you it's the best selling corn.
But I'm okay with that as long as it's an option. And I think that's where we're getting into this world where like people just want different options. And if you give them something where it's like, you don't have to go to the theater, we're going to give you a major motion picture release in the comfort of your own home with somebody you recognize, then a lot of people are going to be like, cool, I'm in.
Well, I mean, we saw it with Trolls 2, right? It made over $50 million video on demand. And part of that's the market and part of that's where we are in the world and part of it's the Trolls property. But the reality is they wouldn't have had that $50 million if they just sat around and did nothing with it. Kind of the last thing to touch on then is really whether or not we want to consider this movie original. And by that, I mean, we sort of talked a little bit about this faux adaptation and the roots of it. And I'm just going to start rattling off things that I found. The first bit, I'm glad you blinked. You're doing that thing where you're very still on Skype, and I wasn't sure if it froze. So
no, I'm here.
Give us a wave. I think the first one that caught me was we're doing these flashbacks of somebody they cared about that's going to motivate this story. We see that in Wolverine to a T with Logan and Jean Grey. We have a character with a death wish who's drinking and jumping and doing stunts and Zane was kind enough to remind me that's pretty much Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon. We've had this character before. We've seen this kind of action. We've seen a lot of this kind of setup with these drug lord things in the Bourne franchises. We have a very Raid type setup. We have a very John Wick type setup. We open on a bridge just like Deadpool does. These aren't just familiar beats to me. This is copy and pasting from other movies.
The DNA. Like there's parts of this when I was like, oh, this is like Taken, where he's going through all these old villages and all these old homes. Like, oh yeah, I've seen this.
But the execution was different enough in the end. So what do you think? Are we sitting on an original movie, or are we sitting on something that built itself on the backs of everything that came before it?
It's funny because I would leave that same thing to kind of question a little bit of John Wick. And John Wick gets this love of being this big original property. And yes, at that time, considering the world that was around it, it was and it is. So I think if you're using that, because John Wick does borrow a lot of things from old school, more so 80s style action films, late 80s, early 90s action films, that the property itself is original, but how they go about doing it may not be original. But we've been doing film so long now that I don't know if you can just outright come up with something 100% original in the execution. What's always going to be is the little threads that make you get from point A to point B. And I think for me, this film at its base level is an original property because it doesn't borrow from it's based on a graphic novel that nobody really heard of, but it's based on a graphic novel that they then used themselves to make a film. So it's a bit of a cheat code, but I think this is an original thing that just happens to have the nuts and bolts of a lot of things that have come before it.
I think to counter the John Wick argument, I would say that we also hadn't really seen a world like that before, where we're trading coins and favors and sort of this notion of the dog and what that represented and a lot of the hand-to-hand stuff. So they built a universe that we hadn't seen and had aspects of characters, where I think Extraction has built a universe that I can download for $30 onto my Xbox and then fed a bunch of other things in there. But where you are right is the execution. It is the little things of, well, I haven't really seen an adult smack children around in an action movie, and this sort of struggle with, should we kill the kid and take the 10 million? And I just won out. So this is the solution to these problems. We keep saying we won out. Let's just do one more unforgivable thing and live on an island forever.
Right.
That's pretty new. I just wish it wasn't all so top heavy in this movie, because it really does start off with me just being like, Deadpool, check. Lethal Weapon, check. The Raid, check. And until we do this 20-minute one shot, which is always going to be an impressive feat in my book, but it is now like we just saw 1917 and all these other things before. So I think we can try a little bit harder to hit, especially with some of these themes we were talking about and ideas. But I think you're right. A holistically original movie is very hard to do. And I am impressed with all the tricks they managed to put into this movie to keep me on a ride that I ultimately did not feel like was unoriginal. It sort of felt like I was on a roller coaster with a new coat of paint, but then the roller coaster went backwards and I loved it again.
Right.
Except for those wooden roller coasters that do that. Those hurt your neck. But do you have anything else to add on top?
No. I think I'm interested to see more stars doing these straight to Netflix, Disney Plus stuff type of films, because I think they've all kind of learned that outside of Star Wars, Marvel, and whatnot, you're not going to get to play in those big sandboxes. So let's take $50 million and make something a little bit smaller that my name can sell alone. And I'm down for all of that I can take, because I miss those middle tier films.
Yeah, if this brings back the middle class of movies that aren't big events, I'm all about it. I just, and it's not an option to go to the theaters right now, so this might be the best time to do it. But
right, that
is our show, folks, and everybody should stay safe and healthy. They should also leave us a review on iTunes, and then they should follow us on Facebook.com/group/Hollywood Already Did It, on Hollywood ADI on Twitter, and Hollywood Already Did It on Instagram. And we will see you next week.
Later.